Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great guest tonight, longtime hemp and cannabis activist Joy Beckerman. Joins us from up at her home in Seattle. We'll talk about her longtime advocacy for both hemp and cannabis. And we have a great hemp news segment for you tonight. So without further ado, bring on the infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Okay, our first story tonight is from Minnesota. Democratic Governor Tim Walz signed legislation into law on May 30th, 2023, making Minnesota the 23rd state to legalize and regulate the adult-use marijuana market. Governor Walz said, quote, "We've known for too long that prohibiting the use of cannabis hasn't worked. By legalizing adult-use cannabis, we're expanding our economy, creating jobs, and regulating the industry to keep Minnesotans safe. Legalizing adult-use cannabis and expunging or resentencing cannabis convictions will strengthen communities. This is the right move for Minnesota," end quote, the governor said. The new law permits adults to purchase up to 2 ounces from state licensed retailers or 8 grams of concentrates or about 800 milligrams worth of edible products. Home cultivate up to 8 plants and possess up to 2 pounds of cannabis in private. The bill also facilitates the automatic review and expungement of records for those previously convicted of certain marijuana-related violations. Adults may legally possess cannabis in Minnesota on August 1st, 2023. State officials at that time will begin to process, reviewing, and expunging tens of thousands of marijuana convictions. By contrast, retail sales of cannabis products are not anticipated to begin until sometime next year. State regulators with the newly created Office of Cannabis Management oversees Minnesota licensing commercial cannabis growers, retailers, and delivery services. On-site consumption will be allowed at certain permitted events. Municipal officials will be able to impose regulations regarding the total number of cannabis businesses and their locations, but they may not prohibit their operations. Retail cannabis sales will be taxed at 10%. Unlike legalization policies enacted recently in several other states, including Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, the law does not provide language protecting those who consume cannabis at home from facing sanctions in the workplace if they test positive for cannabis metabolites on a drug screen. Minnesota will be the 3rd state this year to enact marijuana legalization. Delaware lawmakers passed a pair of bills in April legalizing adult-use cannabis possession and establishing a system for the licensed sale of cannabis products. Under Delaware's new laws, adult-use possession became legal on April 23rd. State regulators must begin accepting retail license applications by August 1st of 2024. Also, Maryland lawmakers recently passed legislation to implement a voter-approved referendum legalizing the use and sale of marijuana products and expunging cannabis-related criminal records. Adults in Maryland will be able to legally possess up to 1.5 ounces of cannabis, 12 grams of cannabis concentrates with no penalty beginning on July 1st. Existing medical cannabis dispensaries will be able to apply for dual licensure to sell to the adult use market beginning this summer. State regulators must start approving additional marijuana business licenses by July 1st, 2024. Additional information is available from the Minnesota Office of Cannabis Management online. Tens of thousands of Rhode Islanders have had their marijuana convictions expunged by the courts in recent months in compliance with provisions of the state's adult use cannabis legalization law. Following an executive order issued by Rhode Island Supreme Court Chief Justice Paul Suttle in late January, the judiciary has reviewed and expunged over 23,000 marijuana possession convictions. Those cases involved marijuana possession and no other charges. In the coming months, courts will also review and begin to expunge convictions in cases where marijuana possession was one of multiple charges or counts. From the state of Missouri, More than 44,000 marijuana cases, including over 10,000 marijuana-related felony convictions, have been expunged in recent months under the provisions of Article 14 of Missouri's Constitution. Those provisions, which were included in the state citizens-initiated adult-use marijuana law, require courts to expunge all eligible misdemeanor marijuana convictions by Thursday, June 8th. Should be done. Many counties have expunged at least 1,000 cases, and in one, more than 2,000 cases have been expunged cannabis law victims' convictions. 23 states and the District of Columbia have enacted laws providing explicit pathways to either expunge or otherwise set aside the records of those with low-level marijuana convictions. Cannabis expungement legislation is currently pending approval in Louisiana from the governor. Federal, state, and local officials have issued over 100,000 pardons for cannabis convictions and more than 1.7 million marijuana-related expungements since 2018. I have 2 federal pardons from President Biden for possession of marijuana under federal law. From Aurora, Colorado, twins who reside in adult-use marijuana states are less likely to report experiencing negative consequences from drinking alcohol as compared to their co-twins who live in jurisdictions where cannabis remains illegal, according to data published in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. A team of researchers affiliated with the University of Colorado and the University of Minnesota assessed the relationship between adult-use cannabis legalization and the use of marijuana and alcohol in a cohort consisting of twins. One twin resided in a jurisdiction where adult-use cannabis sales are legally permitted, while the other lived in a state where they are prohibited. Investigators reported that although the twins residing in legal states consume alcohol at rates similar to their co-twins, they were less likely to report ill effects from drinking. They reported, quote, twins living in a state with recreational cannabis laws reported fewer negative consequences from alcohol use than their co-twin living in a non-recreational cannabis law state, end quote. These results support the hypothesis that more liberal cannabis policies may result in fewer negative consequences from alcohol use. The researchers reported higher levels of cannabis use among twins residing in legal states, a finding that's consistent with prior data. However, twins residing in legal states were no more likely than their co-twins to report experiencing negative consequences as a result of their marijuana use. Twins in legal states did not use tobacco or other controlled substances at a higher rate than their co-twins. This study, evaluating substance use outcomes of recreational cannabis legalization using a unique co-twin controlled design, appears in the American Journal of Alcohol and Drug Abuse. Our last story tonight, federal legislation has been introduced by Representatives Dina Titus, a Democrat from Nevada, and Joe Negus, a Democrat from Colorado, that seeks to establish a new grant program within the National Institutes of Health to fund studies assessing cannabis's medical benefits. The legislation, the Higher Education Marijuana Research Act of 2023, would appropriate up to $150 million in federal funding for university-sponsored medical cannabis research. The legislation also permits academic institutions to purchase state-licensed cannabis products for the purpose of, quote, biological, chemical, agricultural, or public health research, end quote. In recent years, several states, including California, Colorado, Florida, Kentucky, and Utah, have taken steps to establish cannabis research programs via their state's universities. Nevada's U.S. Representative Titus said, quote, the legal responsible use of cannabis has been a major economic driver in Nevada and across the country and deserves further research. Most of that research will come from academia, where right now too many universities and researchers do not have robust protections for even possessing what they are researching. As a former professor, I'm introducing this common sense legislation to support their work and help us all learn more about the effects and potential uses of cannabis, end quote. We're grateful to Representative Titus for introducing this legislation at a time when state cannabis laws are rapidly changing. Despite cannabis being one of the most heavily studied substances, there continue to be significant federal barriers to conducting additional research, particularly involving clinical trials and products that are available in regulated state legal markets. This bill will facilitate trusted university partners to engage in the kinds of research that will best equip state and federal lawmakers and cannabis policies based on public health and safety, and will allow consumers to make more informed choices and will help train the next generation of cannabis researchers. In December, President Joe Biden signed legislation into law, the Medical Marijuana and Cannabidiol Research Expansion Act, facilitating the federal approval of cannabis-specific clinical research and drug development. The law expedited the timeline in which the U.S. Attorney General is provided to either approve or deny applications from scientists wishing to conduct clinical trials involving the use of cannabis by human subjects. That's the end of our hemp news segment tonight. Now we go to our interview with Joy Beckerman, a longtime cannabis activist. She's going to talk about her varied career, and you should enjoy this. Thanks for watching and help us restore hemp. Good night. Hey, I would like to welcome back on the show Joy Beckerman. Haven't you been on our show like as a panel of guests in the past?
Believe I have been, brother. It's time is going by so quickly.
I know. It's hard for me to remember. I think this is like show 1154 or 53 or something. So it's hard to remember everything,
Of
you know.
course it is.
We have about 800 shows on YouTube as well. So, but they're out there. But you've been a long time activist. You're now working with uh, Hemp Ace, right?
That's
Tell us.
my own S corporation. Yep, my own expert witness and legal support firm. I founded that in 2014.
I see. And I saw you at Donnie Wirtschafter's opening of his hemp museum in Ohio.
Oh
I
yeah.
wish I could have made that. I'm glad you did, though.
It's so fantastic what he's got down there, Paul. I mean, he bought a whole beautiful historical building, renovated it into a real life gorgeous museum with a gift shop, and it is incredible. The Word Chapter collection is just huge. And that of course was just the hemp and heckles. I mean, he could do an entire exhibit just on textiles or just on, grain. So it's just amazing. And then of course his whole cannabis and psychedelic collection. It's phenomenal. I can't wait for you to get there, brother.
Yeah, I can't either. He has been a blessing for me in terms of, I had quite, and I still have quite a collection of antique medical marijuana containers, and he has helped me financially by buying those. And now they're part of his permanent collection, going back to like 1840. Lots of different ones from Eli Lilly and Park Davis. But tell us more about your S corporation and what you guys do.
Well, expert witness and legal support for all of hemp. What primarily the clientele has been around the hemp derived cannabinoid industry, because that has been the industry that has been able to afford those services. Although I am part owner in our nation's first hemp grain post prohibition hemp grain processing facility, and am an advisor to Environmental Living Industries, which is a fiber processor. But in terms of my legal support and regulatory specialist services through Hemp Base International, they have been primarily around the hemp derived cannabinoid industry. So, and go ahead.
CBD.
It started out as CBD, and it actually has, I would say, somewhat gone off the rails. In fact, I am exploring some opportunities in some other directions, just because the larger companies, and I have served along the way throughout my Hemp Base International S Corp, also as regulatory officer and industry liaison for Elixinol, which was our first international hemp extract company, and then director of regulatory. Yes, Paul
Oh,
Benham, our heroic brother, and then director of regulatory and legal affairs for Zalise, which is another international hemp extract company. The situation is that, of course, so much of that industry has chilled. First of all, because the FDA, we were in an open rulemaking process, and now the FDA has closed that open rulemaking process, as I'm sure you know, in January 26th of this year, and said, you know what? We are not going to create a regulatory framework for hemp-derived cannabinoids, CBD or otherwise. We need, and this is all baloney, but what they're saying is the existing framework does not accommodate these cannabinoids. We're going to have Congress act. So, in any event, those companies really have had to tighten their bootstraps. They've been tightening their bootstraps for a few years now, really since the beginning of COVID. And that's leaving some of the other industries that have sprung up around this broadened definition of hemp for the synthetic conversion of cannabinoids, and it's not something that I support, or I don't support it morally, ethically, and I don't support it through Hemp Base International either.
I see. So in terms of expert witness, what kind of clientele or cases do you testify in?
Various. My larger clients is the U.S. military, because that situation there is just so untenable. It's clear as a bell. Unfortunately, I mostly have been able to help folks based on technicalities because with the US military, regardless of what branch of service it is, as you well know, Paul, you cannot even consume a hemp seed. You
Yeah.
cannot have Dr. Bronner's hemp seed oil soap on that base. And it's been pretty interesting when I do serve as an expert witness, having to empty out my entire toiletry bag of everything Dr. Bronner's related, or my lip balm. So when a service member, an active service member, is consuming even just CBD, it is unlawful. And so oftentimes it boils down to plant parts, definitions, this type of thing in those matters. Even arguments of cross contamination. There was a matter where a service member tested positive for THC, swore that they had only had some lemonade, but that the lemonade came from a factory where they also made CBD lemonade, infused lemonade, and that could there be cross contamination there? And then, of course, why would CBD test positive for THC? There are many reasons to that, but the primary one, of course, is that the testing themselves, the particularly with GC testing, the cannabidiol decarboxylates and converts into THC. So there are tons of false positives there. And we've actually seen even the entire state of Minnesota halt testing for that reason, and ask the attorney general of that state to go back and look at over 3,000 cases and how those false positives may have improperly impacted the lives of those people. So anyway, that's a big one. And then, of course, state administrative actions, and those are the full gambit because we have such a patchwork of state regulations.
Uh-huh. The military, I was in it then, but they didn't have urine testing. So when they get these false positives, are they urine test based, or do they do any other sort of testing?
It can be all kinds of different kinds of testing. I am not, when I'm testifying, I'm a regulatory specialist and have a specific expertise in the evolution of cannabis and hemp law and policy. But when it comes to the science of it, there are generally other pharmacologists and others who are involved in that part of the case and the testimony.
I
Law versus science, just different aspects of expertise, but certainly urine is a more common way that they use testing in the military, but they have many methods available to them.
so if
And some, by the way, are not even uh tested. Some are just because the possession has been found. I had, and just to tell you how terrible it can be, I had one case with an airman who he was buying CBD cartridge liquid, e-liquid, I guess they call it, that could be refilled into other cartridges. So he then sold that refillable cartridges or refilled cartridges to 8 other airmen and women. All were dishonorably discharged with drug substance abuse on their papers. They lost all of their benefits, including their GI benefits. And the airman whose legal team I was on, he was the drug dealer. He was the kingpin because he had been the one refilling the CBD cartridges. And he was headed for military prison. And in fact, if there hadn't been a technicality, which was, believe it or not, the military never tested the e-liquid, never sent it to a lab. Oh my God, so ridiculous. But thank goodness for that terrible error, because it is that technicality that kept him out of military prison. Again, though, he was dishonorably discharged, lost all of his benefits and his GI benefits. And if a future employer asks him for those discharge papers, it's going to say substance abuse, and it was for CBD cartridges.
That is just horrible. I just recently, last October, President Biden issued pardons for people who'd been found guilty of simple possession of marijuana. And I had been arrested in the United States Capitol while I was at a national normal conference with possession. And so I got a pardon on that. And then I also was arrested and charged with growing marijuana. And I went through a trial. If I had been found guilty, I was going to get a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence. But
Mm.
because the jury wouldn't convict me, and I allowed the judge just to find me guilty of simple possession, so they couldn't, we do, because they were deadlocked 10-2 to convict me of simple possession, which my lawyer argued they should do, and deadlocked 10-2 to acquit me of growing marijuana. And so rather than go back to court again and the prosecutor know my background, I got a possession conviction, and I got a pardon for that one as well. So
I knew half of that story. I did not know about the being arrested in DC and getting a federal pardon from Biden's announcement of pardons last fall. That's just awesome. My God, Paul, really so phenomenal, brother.
So when you first got involved in hemp, didn't you owned a store in Woodstock, didn't you? New
I
York.
did.
And
I did in the mid
let's go back
90s.
before that. And how did you first get interested in hemp and cannabis? And how did you come to open a hemp store and when was that?
That was the mid 90s, 94. I opened that store in Woodstock. You know, you're such a huge part of the tribe. Cannabis is maybe it's in everybody's DNA somehow, but it sure is in mine. And so very quickly after even getting my first infusion of information, which was at a Grateful Dead show in Foxborough, Massachusetts in 1990, when I was presented with a flyer with excerpts from The Emperor Wears No Clothes. And up till that point, I was 20 years old at the time. Now everybody knows my age. Um, and I believed that I naively, foolishly believed we were obviously on some massive course of self-destruction and, we were going to kill the earth and each other before long, but on our way to that inevitable demise, that peace, love, and music, should reign. And so um, when I was at that Grateful Dead show, and I saw that flyer and absorbed that information. And I was raised by an attorney. I don't believe everything that I see or read, but it affected me on a cellular level. And I realized that, wait a second, I think there might be a way out of this inevitable demise. And it looks like the US government has created a felony criminal act out of liberating that potential solution. And it was really that harmonic convergence of a sense of justice, and a sense of planetary healing that really just, it wasn't before long, that I opened up that hemp store about 5 years later, and had already done a lot of activism leading up to that. But I knew that buying hemp and creating the demand for hemp and educating people about hemp is how we were going to advance this mission. And as you well know, I've been involved also in the cannabis movements. I mean, I've sat on NORML's national board of directors and so on and so forth, but very complicated, particularly as once things started to come into the light, and hemp, as you're well aware, reclaimed its place in the broad light of day amongst all of America's other agricultural crops and commodities. And so as this law and regulation gets developed, you basically need to pick your poison. Am I going to be a cannabis legal or regulatory specialist, or am I going to be a hemp legal and regulatory specialist? And so there were certain other things that I still very much involved with on the cannabis side, pregnant and nursing mothers and their use, which I am a proponent of. If you're not in a vulnerable population within that framework or that demographic. And of course, advocacy and the sort of historical federal legal evolution and policy evolution of it. But other than that, industrial hemp is what I specialize in, and Hemp Base International is specific to it.
So in your store, it's I know it's difficult to operate a retail store with the markup and the overhead and all the various taxes and whatnot. But how is it that you came to start that store, and what sort of products did you sell?
Well, you know exactly what kind of, I mean, not because you're not asking me a question you know the answer to, you're just well aware of what products were even available in the mid 90s, right, brother? So hemp baseball hats, t-shirts, um, jewelry, all the hemp jewelry ad nauseum, some hemp paper, thank you very much, Paul, and some other folks. Um, and as you well know, there was also some hemp shoes. There was a beautiful company, not just Ecolution, and I sold some Ecolution things, but also there was, and I think it was called Earth. I feel terrible that I don't remember because I was actually a representative for
I
them.
know
Earth
Adidas
something.
makes hemp shoes. Adidas put out several hemp shoes in the 90s.
They did, absolutely. It's some really beautiful fashions. And then there were some local folks. The Vermont Emporium was manufacturing, which I eventually went on to move to Vermont when the Vermont Hemp Bill passed and became secretary of the Vermont Hemp Council in late 96 and worked for the Vermont Emporium. But they were manufacturing some garments. The thing about it, of course, was hemp activists are not necessarily, garment manufacturers. So Ecolution was great, right? And that other really fashionable. But other than that, it was more like single seams that would rip when you sat down. But we managed to move forward. So those were the products that I sold, and I also had, because it kept people coming in, bear in mind again the 90s, who wanted to spend $27 on a pair of hemp socks, and that's what the going rate was. So I sold candles and essential oils and had everything really smelling good and really colorful as a sort of a merchandising or retail. But the other thing about retail that I think may be the most difficult is theft, both from your customers and your employees. And so that can be really a problem. But then, as I like to tell people, as much as speaking about hemp and educating hemp and singing the song of hemp is what I really love to do. I was burnt on hemp retail by late 1996. It is true. And now, by the way, I am also moving forward in business development for the joy of hemp. So I'll get to sort of do some educating and some getting good products into the hands of folks, but it will be online where I can control the inventory.
So that's a hemp business, the Joy of Hemp, which your name's Joy Beckerman. So that fits perfect.
Little
I,
double entendre there.
I have a grandmother who was named Joy, and my sister's middle name is Joy, named after.
Oh, wow.
We have some joy in our family too.
You certainly do. No, that name has served me very well. It has served me very well indeed.
Yeah. So you were on National Normals Board. When was that?
Let's see. That was um I think maybe it was in 2016 to 2019, if I remember correctly.
Until recently, pretty recently, compared to some of
Yes,
these
yes,
other dates we're
yes,
playing with. Tell me about
yes.
how you became a normal board member, and what drew you into it, and anything you want to share with our audience.
Ah, great. Well,
And
normal
first of all,
national.
Normal is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. Started in
Yay.
1904 in Washington, D.C. by Keith Strop, and they led the charge for decriminalization in the 70s.
Indeed. And what I would say too is that, arguably because they just had their 50th anniversary in 2020, really Keith Strop, the founder.
I misstated. So it wasn't 74. It was 70.
Yeah, it was basically in direct response. I mean, it may be, brother, that they didn't file papers until 74 or something like that, although I could easily, we could all go back and look, it's public. But it was really formed in direct response to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, like an immediate reaction to that. In fact, I believe it was being formed or leading up to that whole piece of legislation that, of course, eventually, passed. But it was when it became known that the idea per the bill was to, create a Schedule One for what is called marijuana in our Controlled Substances Act for the United States. Can't help but always trying to educate. Bear in mind that all of our 50 states also have their own state Uniform Controlled Substances Act. Generally speaking, when something is descheduled or scheduled at the federal level, in those various state statutes, they say that it is automatically scheduled and descheduled in their own state Uniform Controlled Substances Act. But that hasn't always been the case, even when the state statute says that that's supposed to happen. So, for example, when we altered the definition of both marijuana and created a definition for hemp, the definition for hemp didn't affect the Controlled Substances Act because, of course, that's defined in the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946. But it altered and amended the definition of both tetrahydrocannabinols and marijuana in the federal Uniform Controlled Substances Act, and not every state has amended their own version of that definition of marijuana, and that is a sort of a ripe situation for expert witness work as well. It's just very convoluted.
In talking about the Controlled Substances Act, I like to remind our audience that when Richard Nixon imposed it, he was going against the advice of his own commission. And he'd had a commission that came up with a report in 1970 that said it should be legalized. But he went down and he said to Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, who went to prison for felonies for Watergate. He told Bob Haldeman that this is to stop the African American people and leftists in it, to stop them from voting and take out their voting rights. And that was the whole.
And the Jews. As a Jew, I have to say, also, he said, we Jew, why do all these Jews like weed so much there? And why are they all into psychiatry? He's so weird. Nixon was very weird.
Was. Not as weird as Trump. Well, I don't know.
No.
We got a weirder one now. God forbid.
Yeah, we do.
But so you're on the normal board there at a period of critical legalization, did you say, from 2016?
2016 to 2019, I believe. It has been such, pardon me?
We added a lot of legalization states in those years.
We most certainly did. And I was there also as a hemp liaison. So my specialty on the board was with hemp. So, and I'm still, very, very close with a lot of folks on that board. One of my closest friends ever serves on the board. That's the thing when you're a hardcore advocate and a very hard worker. I've worked in also high-end law firms. When I moved to Seattle in 1998 as a young single mother of two, I got into compliance and complex civil litigation at high-end law firms here in Seattle. And so when you have a drive and you have those skills and capabilities and a huge passion, like my life's purpose is liberating this plant. So you sort of do all the work, particularly where that need is. When you say heavy legalization time, just a lot of heavy work, a lot of heavy lifting, and somebody needs to chop the wood and carry the water, right? And so I was a member of tons of boards, presidents, vice presidents, boards, committees, all over the place. And a lot of it was concurrent. And so over time, just having to choose and take care of myself and refocus on where I spend that energy so that I can be most effective and so that I can most optimally deliver on on my life's work and my purpose and my vision here on the planet. And so now I have actually pared it down, my pro bono work, to I am president of the board of directors for the Center for the Study of Cannabis and Social Policy, or CASP, as you may well know. That's Dr. Sunil Agrawal and Dominic Korva co-founded CASP. Dominic is now the director of, he's still, of course, our executive director, but he's now also the director of cannabis studies for Cal Poly Humboldt, and has spent the last year developing that curriculum, and actually also got a $2.7 million grant from the Bureau of Cannabis Control in California for a legacy project that he's doing with Origins, which is just amazing. So I really love, it's a 501c3. It's much more my happy place. 501c6s, of course, being trade associations, 501c4s being advocacy or social welfare corporations. And I feel like now I have earned, after all these decades, and particularly the last one, which has just so pressed the oil out of me. And I'm so proud of all that work, and so proud of all of us. And also am going to my happy place now, and working with just the 501c3, and of course the Cannabis Museum, which is also a 501c3. And I've been working with the Cannabis Museum for years. But those are my happy places, brother, and writing a book and those types of things. So as opposed to burning the candle at both ends and working those 18 hours a days, which again I'm very proud of, and I'm
Now,
so
you're still
so
working,
pleased with the,
really. You're so busy with these different projects too. Well, tell me
yes,
about your book. Can
the
you?
joy of hemp.
Yeah. What a great name.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, the double entendre there. And that book, well, the star of that book is hemp, of course, but the joy of hemp being that double entendre, and really educating folks on sort of the main industries. I mean, we all, you've been saying it probably longer than I have, most likely longer than I have, brother, about we can make 50,000 products. Well, sure, if you count, every flavor of soap, maybe it's down to 10,000. But in any event, really, the stars of the show being hemp grain, nutrition for humans and animals, paper, textiles, building materials, nanotechnology, energy, and energy being renewable natural gas, and of course wood pellets, and all biodiesel to some extent. I'll never believe that that's a good use of the valuable nutrient dense hemp seed, but certainly we can make
When it goes
biodiesel.
rancid, I mean, if it's not fresh, then that's one of the next
Yes,
best things out there, I think.
uses, uses, absolutely. And
And
there's plenty of it that goes rancid along the way.
yeah, so you worked with Exenol and Paul Benham, who's the hemp plastics pioneer right now in terms of a global drop, but Exenol's all over the world as well. What do you want to say about that? Ellis,
Elixinol. Yeah, no, and I always thought, because I've been a huge fan of Paul Benham for years and years, and I remember when Elixinol sort of arrived in the world, and I was just watching it so closely because it was Paul's baby. And I also love the name Elixir and cannabidiol, Elixinol. I always thought that was so great. And that was such a great, fun job. I think, as was made publicly available, not divulging any confidential information here, because Elixinol is a publicly traded company. So when things would happen to that company, it by law had to be public. So as many folks may know, at the very end of 2019, very beginning of 2020, the company was hit really hard, with some financial losses and potential, spending that just wasn't wise, that caused this loss. And that happens when you're expanding all over the world and you're creating new products in a highly regulated, and you're developing success. So the marketing budgets can get out of control, all of that. So there were mass layoffs, and I was able to hang on until almost halfway through 2020. But they had to get rid of basically everybody except for some main marketers and some other folks. But boy, did we have fun. And I got to hang out with Paul last year in Tennessee at the Southern Hemp Expo, and we had an absolute ball. I'm still very much cheering Elixinol on. And oftentimes when people ask me for a recommendation of what brand of CBD, that is one brand that I can absolutely stand by. That one, Hemp Fusion, Charlotte's Web, and Arbor Hemp are some of my favorite CBD companies, just in terms of CGMP compliant and knowing all of their way above CGMP qualities and standards that they go to put out a shelf stable product where what is in the bottle matches what it says on the label.
As you may know, I still work with patients. We just saw a dozen of them here today. Uh,
Mm.
and our doctor is an advocate, especially of CBD. If you were going to recommend CBD products, would you recommend the same companies, or what do you think about the differences?
They're not all doing CBG, as a matter of fact, because this question was recently posed to me. And truth be told, I immediately went to Charlotte's Web's website. I've done so much work on pro bono advocacy work with Charlotte's Web that even though I have not worked directly for them as an employee, I know a lot about those operations and those standards. And yeah, and they're not even doing it. I am not potentially very up to date on the best CBG. I did recently because a friend gave it to me. Lazarus Naturals is a fantastic company as well. I feel badly not mentioning them at the outset. And they're an Oregon company. And I was just given a CBG tincture. I noticed that it is from a CBG isolate as opposed to a CBG sort of full spectrum oil. But I'm really looking forward to try. I just brought it home 2 days ago. We had a Woman of Weed reunion, 10 years already, 10-year reunion this weekend, and that's where I got it. And I'm excited to try that. So I would certainly endorse any product that Lazarus Naturals is making, just making sure with the caveat that someone's aware, should you have a bias against isolate, that is a CBG isolate product. But I'm excited, and it's 1,500 milligrams of CBG in a 30 milliliter bottle.
Yeah. So about the Women of Weed, the 10th anniversary, tell us our audience about that. Was LV Masika able to make it?
No, oh my God, would we have loved that? Oh, would we have loved that? All the invitations went out. Of the traveling, it was a camping one. So of the traveling out of state, which are honorary Women of Weed, because Women of Weed needed to be, I think, Washington residents. But then you could invite each of those 100 gals could invite one person. Tammy Ramsey being the person that I brought in, but Lynette Shaw, at the very last minute she couldn't come, but she was scheduled to join us. But yeah, Women of Weed has been, and it was very healing. It was so important, particularly during those heavy years, the first years of legalization. We, of course, you're in Oregon and followed very quickly, but here in Washington, weed had medical in 98, but adult use in 2012. The first state, along with Colorado, also did 2012. And so Women of Weed was it still is very important. As I said, it was a very healing weekend, having these reflections of women of like mind who we can share ourselves with and learn from and inspire each other with. But during that time in particular, so many women starting cannabis businesses and coming out of the closet, not of their cannabis use, but of maybe they'd been a legal secretary all their life, or they'd worked in a bar all their life, and they wanted to take their stab at cannabis, and just doing a business at all, starting a small business, cannabis or otherwise. And so these gatherings, these Women of Weed gatherings, were a really important part of developing the cannabis industry in Washington state, and particularly the cannabis community and women business owners and women advocates. And while Women of Weed, absolutely, it's a trademark term, and we've all signed contracts. It's not some loosey-goosey club. It's a contractual private member organization. and specific saying we don't do, we don't endorse any real type of advocacy just because it opens up all kinds of just drama that we wanted to eliminate for this special supportive group. Having said that, there's tons of crossover of the Women of Weed and Normal Women of Washington, which organization is basically defunct now, although we've got a great following on Facebook and so on and so forth. But our fearless leader, attorney Danica Noble, who's actually an attorney for the Federal Trade Commission, she now has 3 older children. She's very busy, and the war in Ukraine has taken up a lot of her time. But there was a lot of crossover with Normal Women of Washington and Women of Weed.
Yeah, I bet. So there, you've had involvement in so many different projects. I could just pull out a different one every day and have you elaborate. Tell- Wasn't it the National Hemp Industry Association? Were you on the board for that one?
The Hemp Industries
Yep.
Association.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so funny. They all sound so much alike, right? The NHA is the National Hemp Association. And the NIHC is the National Industrial Hemp Council, which is a newer one. And NHA is fairly new, but NIHC is newer. And then there's the Hemp Industries Association, the HIA, and that was founded and that was the one that I was president of. And that was founded by our friends, brother. That was founded in '94, by many of our tribe and
Yeah.
folks you've traveled the world with.
Herman was the director of that for a while, wasn't she? Andrea?
Who? Tell me.
Andrea Herman? Was it?
She was president. Yes, yes, yes. And Chris Conrad was our first
Oh yeah, he
president.
found it. That's right.
Yep, was one of the co-founders. And I'm so excited to tell you, brother, that in what is today, the 13th? Oh my God, in 7 days, a week from today, I will be taking the Victoria Clipper up to Victoria, BC, and spending 3 days with Ruth Shamai and Chris and Mickey.
Oh wow, cool.
Super
Well,
excited about that.
hi, with lots of love. Maybe we,
You better believe it. I
okay.
surely will. I surely will.
By the way, if you're ever coming through Portland, you've got to stop in sometime.
I promise. You better believe it. I can't wait to. It's amazing. COVID, that just the traveling hasn't happened. Closest I've come to Portland since COVID is not far at all. Hood River. I present at the Provender Alliance conferences. That's, I think, our nation's oldest natural foods and natural products trade association. And I'm going to do a whole day of cannabinoid law and regulation and marketing this October at Provender Alliance. I think it's like their 48th anniversary, but I'll come see you then, brother. I'll come see you in October. If you're not in a field somewhere.
Yeah, you just never know. If they send me the airfare, I'll go. I'm waiting on an airfare
Yep.
right now, but that's another story.
Ah.
Been blessed with a lot of travel over the past. Last saw Donnie in Thailand. That was a very exciting trip. So
I love following it. I love following your travels, you and Teresa. And of course, it tickles me double when I see you with a picture with Donnie. There was Thailand, but then, you also were just running around. Was it Thailand or Colombia? Those photos I saw in the mountains.
I went directly from Medellin, Colombia to Thailand by way of London. And I came back two 11-hour flights. And we came back via Seoul, Korea, and San Francisco. So we actually circled the world. That's the first time I'd ever done the whole round the world thing. I'd crossed the Pacific back and forth several times, but I'd never done it that way before.
I just picture little exhausts of stars and cannabis knowledge just following you all around the world, the trail you
It's
leave.
been very exciting to be able to travel to all these different events. And so I look forward to some more, and maybe we'll be together on some of these. We'll see. We are paths cross out there on the road. So when it comes to just cannabis originally, do you want to talk about when you first used cannabis and how that affected you? Or I know Chris and Mickey work on Namastasi, the spiritual.
Cannamaste.
Namaste. Thank you. You're correcting my pronunciation. I appreciate that.
Takes a village.
Yeah. What do you want to talk about those at all?
Sure. Oh, I'm so happy to. Um, yeah, I mean, I am constantly evaluating my personal relationship with the plant. My personal relationship with the plant, it can be very complicated. And it's wholly separate from my absolute passion and life's work and purpose of liberating this plant so everyone can have their own complicated or not relationship with it. Um, I started consuming cannabis when I was 15. That was the first time I consumed it. I hallucinated my very first time. I've never told this story actually. Well, not in an interview. Um, which I thought was really interesting. It must have been paranoid. I hallucinated. We were in the woods, and I hallucinated police in the bushes by the car.
Oh, a paranoia trip.
And I was trying so hard to impress like my new boyfriend whose weed it was, and there I was saying, and but I guess I was pretty badass even back then because I was saying things like something better to do than into the woods, you fucking police. And anyway, but there was nothing there. uh I use cannabis daily. I have used cannabis daily since I'm at least 18 years old. I consumed cannabis in both of my very healthy pregnancies, and breastfeeding both of my sons, who went on to be student athletes, National Honor Society. They both have master's degrees. One was the chancellor for the University of Washington's advisory committee for UW Bothell. My other one was the president of the UK, meaning University of Kentucky MBA Student Association. And they both have just fantastic jobs. Phoenix Rising, my youngest child, is a labor union organizer, and Spiral Walking in Balance, my second child, is now, despite his master's and the great job that he had at Amazon, has decided he wants to be a commercial pilot, airline pilot. So he's going to flight school and just got his private license. All of that to say, um, that's a big part of the advocacy that I do still hold on to for cannabis, is that use, and particularly for mothers who have morning sickness. I really didn't have morning sickness. It was basically a part of my spirituality, and not being in a vulnerable population. I continued on with my spirituality and my subculture. You know, I Nephi Stella from the University of Washington here, Dr. Nephi Stella, who is just fantastic. I adore him in so many ways. And I remember he was doing a panel here with the Cannabis Alliance, and I work very closely with the Cannabis Alliance here in Washington, and he was talking about that. And you know how it's just so dangerous. And I was like, hold on. And I basically told him the things that I told you just now. And he said, you know, oh well, you were just, you must have needed it for medical reasons. And I said, actually no, this is my spirituality, this is my subculture, this is what I do. And you know, and yes, it did bother my midwives. I had two home births, but it bothered them, it didn't bother me.
All
And
three of,
he said,
all three of our children were born at home with we weren't she wasn't smoking cannabis at the time, but she'd had edibles that day.
she'd had edibles that day. So
That
so
I think, you know, too. Definitely.
yes, yes. So he said to him, well, then, you know, it worked out well for you because you're not in a vulnerable population. And I said to him,
Yeah.
and with the utmost respect, because again, I really love Dr. Nephi Stella. I said to him, well, then, given that that's the case, maybe when you start out with these presentations, instead of saying how dangerous it is, perhaps start with a qualifier. If you are in a vulnerable population, it may be dangerous, as opposed to, oh, it's a horribly dangerous to consume cannabis while you're pregnant and breastfeeding. No, it is not, unless you are in a vulnerable population, or there are some other factors. I mean, home birth isn't even healthy or safe if you're in certain vulnerable populations, right? But in any event, um, I think I want to be authentic. That is, and there's going to be a lot of authenticity in my book, and I think that's what's important for everything to advance. Cannabis, I have had a lot of trauma in my life, and it hasn't even been a quarter of the trauma that most of my friends have experienced in their lives. We all have. Life on earth is traumatic in so many ways. And so cannabis has been a wonderful way for me to not feel my feelings. I haven't been ready to deal. I mean, it's tough to deal with stress or pain or trauma or any of those things. And so my exploration now is, am I using it for creativity right now? Am I using it to relax right now? Am I using it to help me go to sleep right now? Am I using it to escape something uncomfortable that I'm feeling right now? And guess what, guys? It is okay to do that. Um, it's just that we have to constantly be evaluating and analyzing, and maybe today I am ready to feel that feeling, and face that and then grow. So cannabis does many jobs. It is a real Swiss Army knife of a plant. And then I'm just talking about the human aspect of it, not the frickin' industrial agricultural revolution. That's a whole nother show. um, and so one of the things that it can do is help you not feel your feelings. And then it just becomes then incumbent upon us of when is not a good time to feel those feelings and examine those feelings, and with what kind of support, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what's going on with me in cannabis, my brother.
Well, that's why it's so useful for people with post-traumatic stress. You often hear post-traumatic stress referred to as a disorder, but it's really just an honest response to traumatic experiences, whether it be some violent war or a violent spouse or anything in between, so. Well, we're
Anything in
getting
between.
down to the time you need to get going. So let's get back to Hemp Ace, your current business. Tell us again, if someone wanted to contact you, how you can help them and how they can reach you, like your web link. I know you got a domain. Anything else that you'd want to promote?
Thank you so much, man. The thing I always want to promote to people is to engage in the process. That's the main thing I like to promote. And you're wonderful for us about Hemp Ace, hempace.com. Think of me as the ace of hemp. So hempace.com is a way to find my contact information. I can do 30 and 60-minute consultations. You just schedule those and pay for those in advance through my website. And of course, I have monthly and hourly clients that I've worked with for years. But really, anything having to do with a regulatory matter. If you need someone to work with your lawyers who are not particularly well versed in hemp law and policy, but you want someone to help mitigate those legal fees. I've worked with lawyers all my life. I was raised by a lawyer, and so that's a great way for me to sort of help be that bridge, since I am just completely engrossed in hemp law and policy, but in particularly hemp derived cannabinoid regulations.
Well, I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on. We've had Joy Beckerman with Hemp Ace and many other organizations, as this show has demonstrated. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
A, thank you. And B, Paul, you are such a light in the world. And it's just so fantastic to see you moving about the planet the way that you are, decade after decade. It's really us that can't thank you enough, brother. Thank you for everything that you do to continue to liberate this plant and to help people.
Thank you, Joy. Thanks, and keep working to restore hemp. Good night.
You know I will.
I know.
Bye-bye, brother.
Bye-bye.